Hi, I'm David Giovannoni, and I'm one of the people who discovered and deciphered humanity's first recordings of its own voice. In 2007, Rich Martin, Megan Hennessy, Patrick Feaster, and I organized an initiative to make the world's oldest sound recordings available to all people for all time. We call our initiative First Sounds. First Sounds is a loose information-sharing collaborative through which we facilitate the efforts of a broad range of individuals who share our goals and our passions, and who freely give their time and resources. Every First Sounds achievement is the result of their personal commitment and their collaborative spirit. We share our findings on the web under a Creative Commons license to facilitate their dissemination and use. You can see and hear our work at firstsounds.org. As my radio colleague Ira Glass would say, my presentation is in 9 acts, beginning with Act 1, the time machine, in which any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. When Americans went to bed on March 26, 2008, we were in general accord that Thomas Edison had invented sound recording. But when we woke up the next day, we heard this voice gently singing to us in French, firmly telling us we were mistaken. This rendition of the French folk song Au clair de la lune, resurrected from a vault in Paris only days before, is ghostly, haunting, enchanting, and, we later learned, played back at the wrong speed. Yet until that day, the very existence of such a recording had literally been the stuff of science fiction. It was as if we had discovered time travel, or at least a machine that could send your voice into the future. In the next 50 minutes, I'll relate our discoveries as they unfolded. As you'll see, the deeper we got into our 21st century quest, the farther back into the 19th century we went. This might be a bit confusing, so watch for the timeline. As the stories unfold, our timeline will push further and further into the past. Act 2. The Silent Decade. Our quest for sounds recorded between 1877 and 1887. When we established First Sounds back in 2007, the earliest sounds anyone could hear were recorded in 1888. That same year, 1888, Edison's London emissary hosted a dinner followed by a phonographic soiree. In attendance was Arthur Sullivan, not yet Sir Arthur, of Gilbert and Sullivan, who recorded this toast to Thomas Edison.
For myself, I can only say that I am astonished and somewhat terrified at the result of this evening's experiment. Astonished at the wonderful power you have developed, and terrified at the thought that so much hideous, bad music may be put on record forever.
These recordings were made in 1888 on Edison's newly invented wax cylinders, which we can play today without damage. Edison had invented the phonograph 10 years earlier, and the tinfoil recordings that survive from that period cannot be played without damaging them. So that creates a whole silent decade in which recordings were made, but which nobody living today had heard. One of the first things First Sounds asked was, Do any silent decade recordings survive that we might be able to play, whether on tinfoil or any other medium? The answer is yes, quite a few. For instance, just months after inventing the phonograph, Edison and his men recorded the sounds of the brand new elevated railway in Manhattan. Directors of the railroad were receiving all sorts of complaints about the noise, and they engaged the Wizard of Menlo Park to identify and mitigate the sources of the noise. Notice the railroad director here with a bag of money in his pocket. Edison's approach was to record the sounds onto paper covered with a fine layer of soot. He could have recorded these sounds onto foil and played them back in his lab, but he made the recordings on paper because he wanted to examine them visually. Here's a close-up from one of these recordings. You see here it says September 19th. MERR stands for the Metropolitan Elevated Railroad. You see an arrow with the words train down. Something starts at that point, ends several traces later with an X. You can see sound waves traced into the soot-covered paper. They have modulation, probably sound in there. These recordings are preserved in their original notebooks at the Thomas Edison National Historical Park in New Jersey. One of First Sound's first accomplishments was to determine that these recordings could in fact be played back. Working with curator Jerry Fabris, we made high-resolution optical digitizations of each sheet. Jerry had long wanted preservation-grade images of these recordings, and we're pleased that First Sounds was able to contribute those to the archives. We selected a portion of one sheet, processed the traces for clarity, and sent them to Earl Cornell at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, who used the lab's virtual stylus software, built with support from the Library of Congress, to convert the squiggles on the page into sound. In December 2007, this snippet became the very first sound from 1878 to be heard by modern ears. We think these are vocalizations at the beginning of a recording, something like, "Hello, testing, is this thing on?" The voices aren't quite interpretable, but in evoking them we established a powerful proof of concept that our digitization procedure and Berkeley's software could indeed play back recordings made in soot. And as you can imagine, we were elated. This was the first recording from the silent decade to be heard by modern ears. All told, the Edison site has 19 elevated railroad recordings from 1878, every one of which poses an array of significant challenges. But personally, I have high hopes for what we might hear. Contemporary accounts tell us that recordings were made inside the rail cars, traveling at high speed. Recordings were also made from the street, and these may have captured other sounds of New York City in that hot summer of 1878. We know that Edison often chose colorful language, and perhaps these traces captured an example or two of that. But most importantly, these are quite possibly the earliest surviving playable recordings of ambient sound made on American soil or anywhere. Another recording from the silent decade, this one in tinfoil, was purportedly made by Edison and Sarah Bernhardt during her visit to the lab in 1880. I've examined the foil in the Henry Ford Archives in Dearborn, and I'm saddened to report that it hasn't survived the ravages of time very well. But given that Wizard Edison was more than a bit smitten by divine Sarah's charms, I suspect their tete-a-tete would be particularly interesting to hear. Act 3, Before the Phonograph. Our quest for sounds recorded before 1877. As I noted earlier, Edison could have recorded the elevated railroad sounds onto foil and played them back in his lab, but he recorded them onto paper because he wanted to examine them visually. This was not a new idea. Airborne sounds had been traced onto paper since the 1850s by a machine called the phonograph. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, any well-appointed cabinet of acoustical instruments required a phonograph to capture and study the qualities of airborne sounds. When we began our quest, we didn't know if any phonograph recordings from the 1860s or 70s survived. Of course, we'd heard of this Frenchman, Edouard-Léon Scott de Martinville, who invented the phonograph that the instrument maker Rudolf Koenig sold from his atelier in Paris. We knew that Leon Scott, as he signed his name, had applied for a patent on his invention in 1857, and that he updated his application in 1859. His earliest machine, from 1857, recorded on a flat sled that moved along a tabletop. His 1859 machine recorded on a revolving cylinder, and in this form Scott's phonograph eerily anticipated phonographs of the future. With the help of Valérie Marchal and Steve Galizia of the French Patent Office, we made high-resolution digitizations of Scott's patent documents so that we could translate and study them closely. There are 2 phonograms in the patent applications. Unfortunately, they yield no voices. However, the patent documents themselves give us tremendous insight into the sources of Scott's inspiration. Act 4. Organizing the Echo. Scott's quest to do for sound what the camera did for light. Photography was all the rage when Scott first started thinking about the phonograph. This is generally considered to be the first photograph taken from nature. An 8-hour exposure, it was made in 1826 in France by Joseph Niepce. It's the view from the second-story window of his country house. The photograph was an inspiration for Scott's phonautograph, or actually his phonotogram. If the ephemeral reflections of light could be inscribed on a plate, why couldn't the effervescent echoes of sound? Indeed, the idea of doing for sound what the camera did for light was very much in the air at this time of extraordinary invention. For instance, in the U.S., Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that the sun paints, referring to the camera's ability to channel light into a permanent image. He then predicted, "Presently we shall organize the echo, as now we do the shadow." Scott wasn't a poet, but he was a man of letters, being a typesetter and proofreader by trade. His vision of sound photography was not nearly as poetic as Emerson's, but it was certainly more specific in its applications. He wrote, and here I paraphrase, "Is there a possibility of achieving for sound a result analogous to that now attained for light by photography? Can the musical phrase escaped from the singer's lips write itself without the musician's knowledge on a docile paper, and leave an imperishable trace of fugitive melodies? Will one be able to place between 2 men an autographic stenographer that preserves their discussion in its minutest detail while adapting to the speed of their conversation?" Automatic stenography was an application to which Scott was naturally drawn. His father had published a book on the subject in 1849, and as a typesetter he saw great advantages in working from transcripts made by the author's own voice, free of the imperfect interventions of a human interpreter. He gave the example shown here in a patent document. He assumed one could learn to read the waveforms made by the voice and interpret them by eye into written script. Stenography and photography were certainly 2 of Scott's inspirations, but perhaps the most inspirational to Scott was the human ear itself. Scott writes that he was correcting proofs for Professor Longet's treatise on physiology when he got the idea of building an apparatus that would mimic the workings of the human ear and fix sounds graphically. Similar devices had appeared before, but none of them took sounds out of the air. Scott's singular realization was that energy from airborne sounds could be inscribed onto a permanent medium over time. To his knowledge and to ours, no one had done that before. He tells us that he made his first artificial ear experiments in 1853 or 1854. His earliest device is lost to history, but he did leave us with two of his earliest proofs of concept, both from that first year, either 1853 or 1854. He gave both dates. The markings on the left plate were actuated by voice. The markings on the right were actuated by a guitar. Unfortunately, while these squiggles were powered by sounds, their waveforms are too distorted to retrieve the sounds. So here's what we knew at the end of the year 2007. We knew that Scott was recording sounds from the air over time onto permanent media between around 1854 and 1859. He seems to be the first person to have done so, taking as his inspirations the ear, photography, and stenography. Every recording we had seen so far was not playable, but something was telling us that if we looked in the right places, there would be sound to be found. Act 5, Lost and Found Sound, our quest to locate the world's first sound recordings. Early in 1878, when Edison was receiving all sorts of attention for his magnificent tinfoil phonograph, Scott looked on and he seethed as the international press ignored his work of 20 years before. Being in the book business, he self-published a slender volume in which he set forth the priority of his invention. Although it starts with something of a rant against Edison, Scott's book carefully and completely reprinted the text of almost every document he'd ever prepared regarding the phonograph. This was our map to the treasure. Here you see the patent documents from 1857 and 1859. Here he speaks of a communication to the Society of Encouragement in 1857. That led us to this document, which told us, unfortunately, that Scott's work with the Society for Encouragement of National Industry had been lost in a flood. And here we see two deposits by Scott at the Academy of Sciences, one in 1857 and one in 1861. Late in 2007, our researcher in Paris, Aline Gattignon, identified the Scott dossier at the French Academy of Sciences and commissioned photos to be sent to me in the States. A CD full of images arrived at my home on February 29, 2008. As I opened each image, I saw Scott's handwritten explanations of his approach, his procedures, his equipment, his experiments, and a phonogram, and another phonogram, and a luscious phonogram. All told, 7 complete phonograms, every one in frustratingly fuzzy, low-res, JPEG artifact-ridden focus. But all were from 1860, 28 years before the first wax cylinder recordings, 17 years before Edison invented the phonograph. I immediately called Patrick Feaster with the news. We were just weeks away from unveiling first sounds at a major conference at Stanford University. We knew our recovery of sounds from Edison's 1878 recordings would be noteworthy, but if we could get these phonograms from 1860 to talk, now that would be newsworthy. Should I risk a trip to the French Academy of Sciences in Paris to get better digitizations? Could we in fact negotiate the privilege of getting into the archives? Would there be enough time to process these images? And even if we could return to the U.S. with scans in time, would the phonograms speak or sing to us at all? One of the great things about the informal structure of First Sounds is that I didn't have to ask anyone's permission. My translator and I got on the phone, negotiated with the director of the archives, hopped onto the next plane to Paris, ingratiated ourselves into the archives, and, well, as you know, our gamble paid off. We did indeed acquire the images and coax a phonogram from 1860 to sing. Our results were indeed newsworthy. We had recovered what we believed to be humanity's first playable recording of its own voice. We'd prepared a press release with all the basic information, but let me tell you, when your story breaks on the front page of the New York Times, you don't need no stinking press release. Within hours, this was an international story.
The American Thomas Edison is widely regarded as the father of recorded sound, but there are claims now that Mr. Edison was beaten to it by 17 years by a Frenchman. Audio historians have dug up a recording made in 1860 on what's known as a phonograph, a device created by Parisian inventor Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville, and for the first time found a way of playing the sound out loud. On the short clip, a woman can be heard singing Au clair de la lune. And I spoke earlier to the inventor's great-grandson, Laurent Scott de Martinville, and played that recording to him the first time he had heard it.
I'm so happy for him because in his last will he asked his children and grandchildren to make sure that his discovery would not be ignored. This is a moral task that was given to us by his own handwritten will, which this one I have at home, and we were particularly proud in the family. We tried to restore his memory, my father and also my grandfather, and they had a marble plate that was put on the wall of the National Library, Rue Vivienne in Paris. That was the place where he lived for the last period of his life and where he passed away. And on this plate it is said that he had invented how to record sounds. As a matter of fact, when he passed away, he had just been, as a spectator, assisting to the presentation of Mr. Edison's invention in Paris. And his name was not even mentioned, and he was so upset that I believe that this is one of the reasons that eventually ended tragically.
This is going to require the rewriting an awful lot of history books, isn't it?
Well, only a few sentences, but key ones.
That was Laurent Scott de Martinville.
As you can tell, Laurent is a diplomat, literally, having spent 20 years in China negotiating trade agreements between the French and Chinese. He also takes his great-grandfather's charge seriously and personally. Not only has he opened the family archives for us, he's also opened doors that only a Frenchman with his savoir-faire can. In fact, Laurent was instrumental in helping us find an even earlier cache of his great-grandfather's phonograms. The story begins when Valerie and Steve, our friends at the French Patent Office, invited Laurent to see for the very first time his great-grandfather's patent applications. It was a fabulous meeting. We lingered over each handwritten page, steeped ourselves in the inventor's milieu, and told stories about our quest to locate and understand Scott's work. Laurent read to us from his great-grandfather's own copy of his 1878 book, The Treasure Map, in which he tells how the patent application in front of us was supported by the Society for the Encouragement for National Industry. Remember the Society for Encouragement for National Industry, the archives that got lost in a flood, as reported by the Journal of the History of Science Society? I was lamenting this fact when Valerie sparked to attention. Speaking rapidly to Laurent in French, which I don't understand, she left the room. If you ever want to conduct research at the French Patent Office, you'll need a copy of this guide to the archives, which was written by Valerie and her colleague Gérard Emtos. So when Valerie left the room, Laurent put it together for me. He said, "Valerie is calling her colleague Professor Emtos. He is in charge of the archives at the Society of Encouragement for National Industry." She does not believe that all of the archives were destroyed, and she has left to call Girard and ask him to personally look for the Scott dossier. I presume you are okay with that. Professor Entos was out of the office, and I flew back to the States without meeting him. But days later, we were corresponding by email. In one message I wrote, Scott presented prints of phonograms to the Society in the fall of 1857. If they survive in your archives, they would be among the earliest recordings of airborne sounds in existence. Girard wrote back, We have located a dossier of 36 documents comprised of correspondence and various experiments. In our opinion, this exceptional file should make it possible to reconstitute with precision the advancements made by Scott in concert with the Society. What seems to us most exceptional are the original sheets of recorded sounds. They are quite fragile documents, being of soot deposited on thin paper, in other words, phonograms. We invite you to Paris to scan these documents, although an appointment will be necessary. I have available Friday, December 5th. Cordially, Professor Girard Entos. I received this email on Saturday, November 29th, but you can bet that on Friday, December 5th, I was back in Paris. It was immediately evident that these would be among our most important excavations to date, direct evidence of what Scott did, and when he did it, over the course of a whole year of experimentation, 1857. I felt as if our pursuit of the earliest sound recordings had wrapped back in time to converge with Scott's pursuits. We were now in the same groove, if you will, and the sounds encoded in that groove were what we both sought to decipher and understand. So after a day at the Society examining these newly discovered documents, and with digitization gear in tow on the way back to the hotel, I called Patrick to tell him the news.
This is Paris calling. We found 28 phonograms from 1857. They have some very crazy waveforms on them. They all seem to be original, and none of them are playable. None of them, we won't hear any interpretable sound, I don't think, off of any of them.
Before I can convey to you just how wrong I was, we need to review a few technical aspects of phonograms. Act 6, Reading the Calligraphy, Our Quest for Signal in Scott de Martinville's Tracings. Scott intended to make sounds write themselves, so it's only natural that he saw his tracings as brush strokes. For Scott, this was a form of automatic calligraphy, replete with its own conventions and aesthetics. But for those of us seeking to extract the original sounds that created these traces, Scott's results are frustratingly imprecise. As he had no intention of playing back these traces, he didn't need to observe the basic technical requirements of sound recording that we all take for granted. For instance, the requirement that the recording stylus stay in the groove, or in this case, on the paper. For Scott's purposes, it didn't matter if the stylus lifted off the page once in a while. And then, of course, when the stylus came back down, it often smeared the trace. In 21st century terms, there's a lot of missing and ambiguous signal on these recordings. And that's not the worst of it. Here's Scott's diaphragm and stylus assembly from his patent application of 1859. The stylus is made of two pieces, a stiff but yielding shaft, he's used a hog's bristle here, tipped with a small piece of feather. Remember, he was inscribing in soot, and a thin stylus, like a hog's bristle, would not draw a discernible line in the smoke. He needed a feather brush to make the calligraphic strokes visible. Here he shows how the recording head addresses the recording surface. Notice how the tip of the stylus hits the paper at an angle. thereby skewing the signal in the trace. Again, while not an issue for Scott, this is a big problem for us because sound recording demands that the stylus move absolutely perpendicular to the time axis. All of Scott's recordings are skewed to some degree. In some cases we can compensate for it in the image domain before converting to sound like this. But sometimes the skew is so bad and the travel of the stylus so great that the tracing loops back on itself. It actually moves backward in the time dimension. I believe that with the right model and a lot of trigonometry, these tracings may someday be untangled, but until then, no image-to-audio conversion software can handle this signal as expressed on the page. The documents we discovered at the Society of Encouragement for National Industry are rife with these shortcomings. They are, after all, from Scott's first year of experimentation. And that's why I declared in my phone call to Patrick that we'd never get sound off of them because Berkeley's software couldn't track them. But as I said, Patrick proved me wrong. Here's how. Here's a phonograph tracing as processed by Berkeley. Their software tracks the center of the trace in the image domain and converts the centered signal to sound. But what about this crazy waveform? You really can't track it because it's often in 2 or more places at once. So Patrick wondered, what would happen if, instead of tracking the waveform exactly, we could get just a close approximation? He took as his inspiration the optical soundtrack used in film, in which the analog audio signal is represented by the amount of light that gets through the soundtrack. Changes in brightness correspond with changes in audio amplitude. Patrick's technique fills in the area on either side of the trace. It ignores the trace's center and fills only to the 2 edges. It rearranges the parts to resemble a film soundtrack, then scans the track for brightness using image-to-sound software. The result is an audio waveform. Comparing the resulting waveform to the original phonogram, we can see it's not a perfect representation of the recorded trace. But therein lies its brilliance, because the trace itself can't be played. It's not directly interpretable by any form of virtual stylus available today. But the waveform created by Patrick's process can be played. It is interpretable by the ear, and that's what counts at this stage of study. Patrick's approach offers a robust forensic tool that lets us hear at least something from phonograms that are otherwise unplayable as inscribed. We can hear the melody of a song, for instance, or the pitch and cadence of speech, and what we hear helps us better understand Scott's activities and intentions. Act 7, Finding Edouard-Leon, our quest to interpret Scott de Martinville's intent. One of the very first phonograms on which Patrick used his new technique was this one, number 8, made in 1860 and deposited by Scott with the French Academy of Sciences in the same dossier as Eau Claire. Number 8 contains the opening lines from Aminta, Torquato Tasso's classic play from 1573. Here Scott wrote the opening words in the margin. Given the loops and lifts and crazy waveforms traced on this page, I thought we'd never hear what was recorded on it. But the playback from Patrick's technique is amazingly interpretable. As if hearing a recording made in 1860 isn't cool enough, this is the voice of the inventor himself. Here's how we know this is the voice of the inventor. Scott wrote in the margins, "I was wrong. It should have been umane forme, not forme umane." Before we heard this, we didn't know if Scott was referring to the words written on the page, which are in fact transposed, or to the words spoken in the recording. Now that we can hear the recording, we know that he transposed both. So by admitting it was his mistake, by saying, "I was wrong," Scott identifies himself as the speaker. How cool is that? And here's where it gets even more interesting. Scott simultaneously records two things, side by side, on both a Minta and Eau Claire. On one track is the voice as captured from the air. On the other are the vibrations of a tuning fork, or diapason. So why did he record a tuning fork when he was really interested in recording the sounds from the air? Well, it's important to remember that Scott was developing his phonograph as a laboratory instrument. He understood that cranking the mandrel by hand yielded an uneven rotational speed, so to calibrate the voice recording in time, he traced the vibrations of a tuning fork alongside the voice track as a time reference. 19th century time code. How totally steampunk of him. When we convert each phonogram from an image to sound, we process each of the two tracks in parallel. Here's what Eau Claire sounded like when we first heard it. On the left is the voice, and on the right is the tuning fork. You can hear the wobbliness of Scott's cranking as he made the recording. Let's isolate just the tuning fork track. The pattern of Scott's cranking becomes very apparent. With today's technologies, we can stabilize the voice recording by stretching or squishing the tuning fork track to compensate for the variations in cranking speed. After time correction, the tuning fork track goes from this to this. Once the fork is stabilized, the voice snaps into place. It goes from shaky to solid. Another advanced feature of Scott's two-channel recordings, the pitch of the tuning fork establishes the correct playback speed. Scott wrote that his tuning fork was calibrated to 500 simple vibrations per second. When we first played Eau Claire back in 2008, we had to determine what he meant by that. Today we measure frequency in cycles, a cycle meaning a full positive and negative excursion of the sound wave. But in the 19th century, French acousticians measured things differently. For them, a simple vibration was half a cycle. What we call one cycle, they called a double vibration, the combination of two simple vibrations. We'd done our homework and we knew that, but it wasn't clear to us that Scott knew that. On screen right now is one of his own explanatory diagrams. From A to B, he writes, is one simple vibration. From A to alpha, he contends, is one double vibration. Notice that his terminology is in conflict with his colleagues. A to B is actually a half of what they'd call a simple vibration, and A to alpha, rather than being a double vibration per Scott, was actually a single vibration in common French parlance. Confused? Well, so were we. By 500 simple vibrations per second, Scott could have meant that his tuning fork was vibrating at 125 Hertz, or 500 of these, as his own notes imply, or at 250 Hertz, 500 of these, as acousticians of the day would have understood, or at 500 hertz, the unit that seems most obvious to us today. Scott wasn't a scientist, so we can excuse his confusion, but he did leave us with a conundrum. As we prepared Eau Claire for its world premiere in 2008, we settled on 500 hertz as the voice that sounded most right to us. And in doing so, we introduced the now iconic voice of a haunting apparition to the world. But wait a minute. Scott writes that he recorded a Minta with the same tuning fork as Eau Claire. And when we first played back a Minta at 500 hertz, this is what we heard. Both the cadence and the pitch are unnatural. Clearly, this is too fast. So without a doubt, Scott's fork vibrated at 250 hertz, not 500 hertz. Well, this changes everything. It suggests that Eau Claire was played back twice as fast as it should be. And sure enough, when we slow Eau Claire to the same calibration speed as a Minta, Scott's self-identified voice appears from the smoke. This is Scott speaking slowly, clearly, lugubriously, as he watches the stylus vibrate to the sounds of his own voice. We had also played back a recording of a vocal scale made in May 1860, just a month after Eau Claire, at the same speed as Eau Claire. But again, when we slow the recording to its correct speed, the voice of the inventor conducting an experiment again emerges. We made this discovery early in 2009, nearly a year after releasing our initial interpretation of Eau Claire into the world. Our initial discovery had prompted a lot of romantic poetry of the beckoning Parisienne phantasm reaching across time through a veil of smoke that would never part, and so forth and so on. But now we'd opened a different window onto time, and through that window we were hearing the voice of a lone inventor conducting an experiment, recording sound in Paris, the Second French Empire, before the American Civil War, the first human in history to preserve his own voice and send it into the future. I'd like to play for you one more of Scott's 1860 recordings from his Academy of Sciences deposit. In this, he sings a lively rendition of Fly Little Bee from a comic opera by Victor Massé, written just 4 years before. To our knowledge, this is Scott's last phonotogram from the fall of 1860. It's certainly one of his most melodic, joyful, and playful recordings. Perhaps he just got tired of conducting experiments. So, With the 1860 recordings played at the right speeds, our correction of the record is complete. Let me state the facts clearly. The April 9th, 1860 recording of Au clair de la lune currently stands as humanity's first dated and playable recording of its own voice. It was sung by Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville in Paris, France, and that's the last word on the subject, at least until we discover and play something earlier. Act 8, The Imperfect Mirror, the quest for fidelity between the inscribed line and the sound that produced it. As noted earlier, Scott wasn't a scientist, but through his work at the Martinet printing house, he met enough scientists and learned enough about their pursuits to realize that the fledgling field of acoustics could benefit from an instrument that registered airborne sounds. In January 1857, he deposited his earliest experiments at the French Academy of Sciences, entered into the record by Academy members Claude Pouillet, Henri-Victor Regnault, and Claude Bernard. About the same time, his work was noted by the Society of Encouragement for National Industry, a body established to promote ideas and technologies in service to French industry. The Society of Encouragement spawned into practice what the Academy of Sciences conceived in theory. The Society gave Scott the funds to register his initial March 1857 patent and to conduct experiments from spring through fall with members of the Society at his side. Members such as Jules Lissajous, a pioneer in the science of acoustics. Lissajous first demonstrated the figures that bear his name while working with Scott in 1857. Scott reported his progress to the Society late in 1857, complete with samples of phonograms. Lissajous assembled these documents into the dossier we saw earlier as he undertook his evaluation for the Society's Committee of Economic Arts. On the surface, Lissajous' evaluation is quite positive. It clearly states that Scott's original contribution was to trace the vibrations of airborne sounds onto a permanent medium over time. He wrote, and I paraphrase, "If the apparatus were to measure only pitch and timbre, this would still be of great service to science. However, Mr. Scott, driven by an overly vivid imagination, seeks in these traces information of a higher order. He believes his apparatus can indicate articulation. We believe on this point he is completely in error." It would be wrong for us to dismiss Lissajous' conclusion as short-sighted, as it was based on his legitimate concern about the accuracy of the phonograph's tracings, that is, the fidelity between the inscribed line and the sound that produced it. This would not be a concern, Lissajous continued, if the movement of the membrane were the faithful translation of the motion of the air which agitates it, and if the motion of the stylus represented the motion of the membrane with the same facility. Unfortunately, he concluded, these intermediaries disfigure the vibration, exactly as a mirror of a regular surface modifies the aspect of a figure seen in it. So here's the crux of the problem that would frustrate Scott for the rest of his days. Limitations in the technology, limitations in acoustical theory, and limitations in his ability to demonstrate to the scientific establishment that there was more information in his phonographic tracings than met the eye. Today, we have that technology, and we can now state without reservation that both men were right. We can indeed coax from the trace recognizable sounds, interpretable words, the articulations that Scott believed were there. Yet, as Lissajous feared, they are most certainly disfigured. Distorted as the vibrations may be, they open a window onto the following experiment that Lissajous himself may have attended in 1857, an experiment to determine the phonograph's ability to record the timbre of a musical instrument. This is the earliest airborne sound reproduced to date. Let me be clear. Eau Claire remains humanity's first playable dated recording of its own voice. But this scale, played by an unidentified cornetist, holds the record for the earliest airborne sound recording reproduced to date. 1857, 3 years before Eau Claire de la Lune. 1857, 20 years before Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. 1857, 31 years earlier than any recording any living person had heard before first sounds made the silent decade speak. Act 9. Did the French invent everything? Our quest for international accord. We begin with the obvious. Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville invented sound recording. Now this was not obvious before 2008, because at that time we had no proof. Sure, we knew that Scott conceived the idea of recording airborne sounds over time, and we knew this idea had been put into practice by Koenig and other instrument makers, but only after we located his own recordings, and only after we evoked interpretable sound from them, did we know for sure that Scott's traces were accurate enough to be called sound recordings. Now that we're certain he succeeded, our accolades go to Monsieur Scott of Paris. The French hold that Charles Cros anticipated Edison's idea of sound reproduction based on Cros's handwritten pli caché deposited with the French Academy of Sciences in April of 1877. This claim is true. In suggesting that Scott's traces be photo-engraved and used to drive a diaphragm, in other words, by reversing the process of recording, Charles Cros anticipated the idea of sound reproduction before Edison. For that, we must give Monsieur Cros his due recognition. A few weeks later, Edison and his men came to a similar idea by a very different route. They used a stylus to indent the vibrations of a telephone receiver on a moving strip of paper. By pulling the indented paper under a second stylus and diaphragm, they essentially put the vibrations back into the air. By all accounts, they recorded and played back speech all summer long without grasping the full import of this invention. Early in the fall of 1877, during Edward Johnson's lectures about Edison's recent experiments, the marvel of capturing and reviving voices became manifestly evident to audiences and to the press. So much so that Johnson cut short his lecture tour, raced back to the lab, and encouraged the inventor to develop this idea, which Edison did. A month later, the iconic first phonograph was built. So while the idea of sound reproduction was in the air on both sides of the Atlantic in 1877, it was Thomas Edison, Charles Batchelor, John Cruzy, and others in Menlo Park, New Jersey, who built the first self-contained system that captured, stored, and reproduced airborne sounds. The historical record is clear. Each of these three men, Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville, Charles Cros, and Thomas Edison, each conceived of something new, and each deserves credit and recognition. Unfortunately, Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville died in 1879 without receiving his due recognition. Left without funds or pension, his family was forced to yield his remains to an unmarked grave. Laurent Scott de Martinville has searched all of Paris, but has yet to find his great-grandfather's final place of rest. What an irony. The first man to send his voice into the future, lost forever in Paris, resurrected for all time in America. So that's the story of how First Sounds discovered and played back humanity's first recordings of its own voice. For more information, go to firstsounds.org. I'm David Giovannoni. Thanks for listening.